So let's begin with you, Mr. Yuan.
I think this new initiative of Chinese new leadership to think about the future of the relations, because U.S. and China relations now is changing. We cannot guideline the changing U.S.-China relations according to our old framework and old thinking. So to deal with those changing new relations, we're bound to have some new thinking. That is a new model of the relations. So those non-confrontation, non-conflict, mutual respect, and win-win cooperation, I think through those three respects, to show Chinese sincerity in improving the new relations in the more stable and peaceful future.
And now let's get a Washington perspective from Mr. Scott Bays. He's president of the Center for National Policy. Mr. Bays, how do you read into the principles of this new model of major country relationship?
Well, at least from the American perspective, we look at the U.S.-China relationship as too big to fail. Together, we represent a third of world economic production, a quarter of the world's population, a fifth of global trade. So indeed, we have to make sure that we manage this relationship correctly. But I do have to say the idea of no conflict, no cooperation, I think is a little unrealistic. There are points of principle that both countries have that we have to talk about, mostly in private, sometimes in public. I'm thinking about South China Sea, cyber, and cybersecurity. These are going to be conversations that have to continue. But to the larger point that your guests have spoken about, yes, this has to be a different approach when you're talking about rising and established powers. There is a successful model. It happened, the U.S. and Britain, over 150 years. We set up global institutions, rule of law, defeated fascism. I could go down the list. So there are positive models to look at of relationships between two very large powers. We certainly don't want to go back to the old U.S.-Soviet model of conflict, and I think that this U.S.-China relationship will be much better than that.
Well,
in fact,
certainly
there
will always be differences between the two countries, and there have been ups and downs in bilateral relations between China and the U.S. So Mr. Xi Jinping is urging more understanding and trust between the two sides to avoid misunderstanding and miscalculation in each other's strategy. So we'd like to be clear about these miscalculation, misunderstanding. How do you read into this? Or did any of that happen before, Mr. Yuan?
Yeah, U.S. and China relations is very complicated. We have lots of common interests and also lots of differences and suspicious. Some problems is very structural, like Taiwan issue, like the difference of a social system and political system, which cannot resolve overnight. But many other issues are really because of a misunderstanding and miscalculation. For example, Chinese new initiative of One Belt, One Road, and actually it's a really initiative. It's not a strategy. It's a cooperation between China and the relevant countries.
It's about linking up countries along the road and sharing the economic prosperity of the Chinese.
Yes, but this kind of a very good initiative is viewed by many Americans as the Chinese want to be the regional hegemon. This is totally a miscalculation, a misunderstanding. And for Chinese side, when we're talking about American rebalancing to Asia, even if there are some actions against the rise of China, but cannot be easily or 100% think it's just about China. So how to decrease this kind of mutual suspicions, to rebuild mutual trust, is something we do want to do in the future to establish the so-called new model of major power relations.
Well, Mr. Bates, you mentioned differences between the two countries. Do you think the two countries can solve their differences and to avoid misunderstanding and miscalculations?
We're going to have to, and I think neither side will always get what they want to, but over time, as there is increased cooperation on things, you see it on Iran, on North Korea, on climate change. These are the positive foundations on which you build, and that's where the trust comes from, is the constant interaction, cooperation. You know, the real challenge, long term, I referenced the U.S. and Britain. We had common languages, institutions, traditions. We don't really have that with China. We have to build much more ties society to society. China sends 250,000 students to the U.S., which is great. The U.S. only sends about 15,000. We have to deepen the long-term relationship while really working hard and giving the benefit of the doubt on some of these flashpoint issues that we talked about and manage potential crises that could develop. That will be our biggest challenge in the next, let's say, 10 to 15 years. If this time period goes well, I think we can count on a strong, stable Asia-Pacific for years to come.
And gentlemen, as we mentioned earlier in the program, it's been 30 years since the term of a new model of major country relationship has been proposed by President Xi. So what are your observations of the changes that's been taking place since the proposal of this idea between relations between China and the U.S.? Mr. Bates, do you see any differences?
Well, I think there's a recognition about the importance of respect to Chinese partners, and so we have to take that into account in every interaction that we engage in with Chinese partners. The idea of conflict and cooperation, that's one that has to be managed. There will be conflict. We have to be realistic about that and respect when it's based on principles that are unshakable. The U.S. principles of freedom of navigation, movement of people, ideas around the world. This is going to come into conflict on occasion with the PRC, and we have to work through that in a way that respects also U.S. opinion. So long as we go from the respect point, I think we can avoid things in both our societies kind of developing beyond the control of the politicians to handle the situation.
And certainly more details will be rolled out in the next few days. Thank you so much, Mr. Scott Bates, joining us from Washington, D.C., and Mr. Yuan Peng joining us in our Beijing studio.